Early in the morning, the fog lights of Mersault's car were gleaming along the coast road. Leaving Algiers, he passed milk carts, and the warm smell of the horses made him even more aware of the morning's freshness. It was still dark. A last star dissolved slowly in the sky, and on the pale road he could hear only the motor's contented purr, and occasionally in the distance the sound of hooves, the clatter of milk cans, until out of the dark his lights flashed on the shining iron of the horseshoes. Then everything vanished in the sound of speed. He was driving faster now, and the night swiftly veered to day. Out of the darkness still retained between the hills, the car climbed an empty road overlooking the sea, where the morning declared itself. Mersault stepped on the gas. The tiny sucking sound of the wheels grew louder on the dewy pavement. At each of the many turns, Mersault's brakes made the tires squeal, and as the road straightened, the sound of the motor gaining speed momentarily drowned out the soft voices of the sea rising from the beaches below. Only an airplane permits man a more apparent solitude than the kind he discovers in an automobile. Utterly confident of his own presence, satisfied with the precision of his gestures, Mersault could at the same time return to himself and to what concerned him. The day lay open now at the end of the road. The sun rose over the sea, awakening the fields on either side of the road, still deserted a moment before, filling them with the red fluttering of birds and insects. Sometimes a farmer would cross one of these fields, and Mersault, rushing past, retained no more than the image of a figure with a sack bending over the moist, clinging soil. Again and again the car brought him to the edge of slopes, overlooking the sea. They grew steeper, and their outline, barely suggested in the light of dawn, grew more distinct now, suddenly revealing prospects of olive trees, pines, and whitewashed cottages. Then another turn hurled the car toward the sea, which tipped up toward Mersault like an offering glowing with salt and sleep. Then the car hissed on the pavement and turned back toward other hillsides and the unchanging sea. A month before, Mersault had announced his departure to the house above the world. He would travel again, then settle down somewhere around Algiers. Several weeks later he was back, convinced that travel now meant an alien way of life to him. Wandering seemed no more than the happiness of an anxious man. And deep inside himself he felt a dim exhaustion. He was eager to carry out his plan of buying a little house somewhere in the Chenua, between the sea and the mountains, a few kilometers from the ruins of Tipasa. When he arrived in Algiers, he had envisioned the setting of his life. He had made a large investment in German pharmaceuticals, paid a broker to manage his holdings for him, and thereby justified his absences from Algiers and the independent life he was leading. The investment, moreover, was more or less profitable, and he made up for his occasional losses, offering without remorse this tribute to his profound freedom. The world is always satisfied, it turns out, with a countenance it can understand. Indolence and cowardice do the rest. Independence is earned by a few words of cheap confidence. Mersault then concerned himself with Lucienne's fate. She had no family, lived alone, worked as a secretary for a coal company, ate little but fruit, and did Swedish exercises. Mersault lent her books, which she returned without a word. To his question she replied, "Yes, I liked it, or else it was a little sad." The day he decided to leave Algiers, he suggested that she live with him, but continue to keep her apartment in Algiers without working, joining him when he sent for her. He proposed this with enough conviction for Lucienne to find nothing humiliating in the offer. And in fact, there was nothing humiliating in it. Lucienne often realized through her body what her mind could not understand. She agreed. Mersault added, "If you want, I can marry you, but I don't see the point." "Whatever you prefer," Lucienne said. A week later he married her and made ready to leave the city. Meanwhile, Lucienne bought an orange canoe to skim over the blue sea. Mersault twisted the wheel to avoid a venturesome hen. He was thinking of the conversation he had had with Catherine, the day he had left the house above the world. He had spent the night alone in a hotel. It was early in the afternoon, and because it had rained that morning, the whole bay was like a wet pane of glass, the sky utterly blank above it. The cape at the opposite end of the bay stood out wonderfully clear, and lay, gilded by a sunbeam, like a huge summer snake upon the sea. Patrice had finished packing, and now, his arms leaning on the sill, he stared greedily at this new birth of the world. "But if you're happy here, why are you leaving?" Catherine had asked. "There's the risk of being loved, little Catherine, and that would keep me from being happy." Coiled on the couch, her head down, Catherine stared at Patrice. Without turning around, he said, "A lot of men complicate their lives and invent problems for themselves. In my case, it's quite simple. Look." He spoke facing the world, and Catherine felt forgotten. She looked at Patrice's long fingers on the sill, studied his way of resting his weight on one hip, and without even seeing his eyes, she knew how absorbed his gaze would be. But she broke off, still staring at Patrice. Small sails began riding out to sea, taking advantage of the calm. They approached the channel, filled it with fluttering wings, and suddenly sped outward, leaving a wake of air and water that widened in long, foamy trails. From where she sat, Catherine watched them make their way out to sea, rising around Patrice like a flight of white birds. He seemed to feel the weight of her silence and her stare. Turned around, took her hands, and brought them close to his own body. "Never give up, Catherine. You have so much inside you, and the noblest sense of happiness of all. Don't just wait for a man to come along. That's the mistake so many women make. Find your happiness in yourself." "I'm not complaining, Mersault," Catherine said softly, putting one hand on Patrice's shoulder. "The only thing that matters now is that you take good care of yourself." He realized then how easily his certainty could be shaken. His heart was strangely hard. "You shouldn't have said that just now." He picked up his suitcase and went down the steep stairs, then down the path from the olive trees to the olive trees. There was nothing ahead of him now except the Chenua, a forest of ruins and wormwood, a love without hope or despair, and the memory of a life of vinegar and flowers. He turned around. Up above, Catherine was watching him leave, motionless. In a little less than 2 hours, Mersault was in sight of the Chenua. The night's last violet shadows still lingered on the slopes that plunged into the sea, while the peak glowed in the red and yellow sunlight. There was a kind of vigorous and massive assertion of the earth here, thrusting up from the Sahel and silhouetted on the horizon, ending in this enormous bestial back that plummeted straight down into the sea. The house Mersault had bought stood on the last slopes, 100 yards from the water, already turning golden in the heat. There was only one story above the ground floor and only one room in it, but this room was enormous and overlooked the front garden and the sea through a splendid bay window opening onto a terrace as well. Mersault hurried up to it. The sea was already forming scarves of mist, and its blue darkened while the warm red of the terrace tiles glistened in the morning dew. The whitewashed parapet had already been conquered by the first tendrils of a triumphant rambler rose. The firm white flesh of the open petals, sharp against the sea, was both voluptuous and satiating. Downstairs, one room faced the foothills of the Chenua, covered with fruit trees. The other two opened onto the garden and the sea beyond. In the garden, 2 pines thrust their bare trunks high into the sky, the tips alone covered with a green and yellow pelt. From the house, he could see only the space bracketed between these 2 trees, the curve of beach between the trunks. A little steamboat was moving out to sea now, and Mersault watched its entire trajectory from one pine to the other. Here was where he would live. Doubtless because the beauty of the place touched his heart. Why else had he bought this house? But the release he hoped to find here dismayed him. This solitude he had sought so deliberately seemed even more disturbing now that he knew its setting. The village was not far away, a few hundred yards. He walked out of the house. A little path sloped down from the road toward the sea. Following it, he noticed for the first time that he could glimpse across the bay the slender peninsula of Tipasa. At its very end were silhouetted the golden columns of the temple, and around them the fallen ruins among the wormwood bushes forming at this distance a blue-gray plumage. On June evenings, Mersault reflected, the wind would bring the fragrance of those sun-gorged shrubs across the water toward the Chenua. He had to set up his house, organize his life. The first days passed quickly. He whitewashed the walls, bought hangings in Algiers, began to install electricity, and as he went about his work, interrupted by the meals he took at the village cafe and by his dips in the sea, he forgot why he had come here and lost himself in his body's fatigue. Loins aching and legs stiff, fretting over the shortage of paint or the defective installation of a light fixture in the hallway. He slept at the hotel and gradually became acquainted with the village, the boys who came to play pool and ping-pong on Sunday afternoons. They would use the table all afternoon, taking only one drink to the owner's great annoyance. The girls who strolled in the evening along the road overlooking the sea. They walked arm in arm, and there was a caressing sing-song note in their voices. Perez, the fisherman who supplied the hotel with fish and had only one arm. Here, too, he met the village doctor, Bernard. But the day the house was entirely ready, Mersault moved all his things into it and gradually recovered himself. It was evening. He was in the big room upstairs, and behind the window 2 worlds fought for the space between the 2 pines. In one, almost transparent, the stars multiplied. In the other, denser and darker, a secret palpitation of the water betrayed the sea. So far he had lived sociably enough, chatting with the workmen who helped him in the house or with the owner of the cafe. But now he realized that he had no one to meet tonight, nor tomorrow, nor ever, and that he was facing his longed-for solitude at last. From the next moment he no longer had to see anyone. The next day seemed terribly imminent. Yet he convinced himself that this was what he had wanted. Nothing before him but himself for a long time, until the end. He decided to stay where he was, smoking and thinking late into the night. But by 10 he was sleepy and went to bed. The next day he awakened very late, around 10, made his breakfast and ate it before washing or shaving. He felt a little tired. He had not shaved and his hair was uncombed. But after he had eaten, instead of going into the bathroom, he wandered from room to room, leafed through a magazine, and finally was delighted to find a light switch that had not been attached, and set to work. Someone knocked, the boy from the cafe bringing his lunch as he had arranged the day before. He sat down at his table just as he was, ate without appetite before the food had a chance to cool, and began to smoke lying on the couch in the downstairs room. When he awakened, annoyed at having fallen asleep, it was 4 o'clock. He bathed then, shaved carefully, dressed and wrote 2 letters, one to Lucienne, the other to the 3 girls. It was already very late and growing dark. Nonetheless, he walked to the village to mail his letters and returned without having met anyone. He went upstairs and out onto the terrace. The sea and the night were conversing on the beach and above the ruins. Mersault reflected. The memory of this wasted day embittered him. Tonight at least he would work, do something, read or go out and walk through the night. The garden gate creaked. His dinner was coming. He was hungry, ate happily, then felt unable to leave the house. He decided to read late in bed. But after the first pages his eyes closed, and the next morning he woke up late. In the days that followed, Mersault tried to struggle against this encroachment. As the days passed, filled by the creak of the gate and countless cigarettes, he was disconcerted by the variance between the gesture which had brought him to this life and this life itself. One evening he wrote Lucienne to come, deciding to break this solitude from which he had expected so much. After the letter was sent, he was filled with a secret shame. But once Lucienne arrived, the shame dissolved in a kind of mindless, eager joy to rediscover a familiar being, and the easy life her presence signified. He made a fuss over her, and Lucienne seemed almost surprised by his solicitude, when she wasn't preoccupied with her carefully pressed white linen dresses. He took walks now, but with Lucienne. He recovered his complicity with the world, but by resting his hand on Lucienne's shoulder. Taking refuge in humanity, he escaped his secret dread. Within 2 days, however, Lucienne bored him, and this was the moment she chose to ask him to let her live there. They were at dinner, and Mersault had simply refused, not raising his eyes from his plate. After a pause, Lucienne had added in a neutral tone of voice, "You don't love me." Mersault looked up. Her eyes were full of tears. He relented. "But I never said I did, my child." "I know," Lucienne said, "and that's why." Mersault stood up and walked to the window. Between the pines, the stars throbbed in the night sky. And never had Patrice felt, along with his dread, so much disgust as at this moment for the days they had just passed together. "You're a lovely girl, Lucienne. I can't see any further than that. It's all I ask of you. It has to be enough for the 2 of us." "I know," Lucienne said. She was sitting with her back to Patrice, scoring the tablecloth with the tip of her knife. He walked over to her and rested a hand on the nape of her neck. Believe me, there is no such thing as great suffering, great regret, great memory. Everything is forgotten, even a great love. That's what's sad about life, and also what's wonderful about it. There is only a way of looking at things, a way that comes to you every once in a while. That's why it's good to have had love in your life after all, to have had an unhappy passion. It gives you an alibi for the vague despairs we all suffer from. After a pause, he added, I don't know if you understand what I mean. I think I understand. She suddenly turned her head toward Mersault. You're not happy. I will be, Mersault said violently. I have to be. With this night, this sea, and this flesh under my fingers. He had turned back toward the window and tightened his hand over the nape of Lucien's neck. She said nothing. Then, without looking at him, At least you feel friendly toward me, don't you? Patrice knelt beside her and gently bit her shoulder. Friendly, yes. The way I feel friendly toward the night. You are the pleasure of my eyes, and you don't know what a place such joy can have in my heart. She left the next day, and the day after that Mersault was unable to stand himself and drove to Algiers. He went first to the house above the world. His friends promised to come to see him at the end of the month. Then he decided to visit his old neighborhood. His apartment had been rented to a man who ran a cafe. He inquired after the barrel maker, but no one knew anything. Someone thought he had gone to Paris to look for work. Mersault walked through the streets. At the restaurant, Celeste had aged, but not much. René was still there with his tuberculosis and his solemn expression. They were all glad to see Patrice again, and he felt moved by this encounter. Hey, Mersault, Celeste told him, you haven't changed, still the same. Yes, Mersault said. He marveled at the strange blindness by which men, though they are so alert to what changes in themselves, impose on their friends an image chosen for them once and for all. He was being judged by what he had been. Just as dogs don't change character, men are dogs for one another. And precisely to the degree that Celeste, René, and the others had known him, he had become as alien and remote to them as an uninhabited planet. Yet he left them with affectionate farewells. And just outside the restaurant, he ran into Martha. As soon as he saw her, he realized that he had almost forgotten her, and that at the same time he had wanted to meet her. She still had her painted goddess's face. He desired her vaguely but without conviction. They walked together. Oh, Patrice, she said. I'm so glad. What's become of you? Nothing, as you can see. I'm living in the country. Wonderful, I've always dreamed of living in the country. And after a silence, You know I'm not angry at you or anything. Yes, Mersault said, laughing. You've managed to console yourself. Then Martha spoke in a tone of voice he did not recognize. Don't be nasty, Patrice. I knew it would end like this someday. You were a funny guy, and I was nothing but a little girl. That's what you always used to say. Of course, when it happened, I was furious. But finally I told myself, he's unhappy. And you know, it's funny, I don't know how to say it, but that was the first time that what happened between us made me feel sad and happy at the same time. Surprised, Mersault stared at her. He suddenly realized that Martha had always been very decent with him. She had accepted him as he was and had spared him a great deal of loneliness. He had been unfair. While his imagination and vanity had given her too much importance, his pride had given her too little. He discovered the cruel paradox by which we always deceive ourselves twice about the people we love, first to their advantage, then to their disadvantage. Today he understood that Martha had been genuine with him, that she had been what she was, and that he owed her a good deal. It was beginning to rain, just enough to reflect the lights of the street. Through the shining drops he saw Martha's suddenly serious face and felt overcome by a burst of gratitude he could not express. In the old days he might have taken it for a kind of love, but he could find only stiff words. You know, Martha, I'm very fond of you. Even now, if there's anything I could do. She smiled. No, I'm young still, and I don't do without. He nodded. What a distance there was between them, and yet what complicity. He left her in front of her own house. She had opened her umbrella, saying, I hope we'll see each other again. Yes, Mersault said. She gave him a sad little smile. Oh, that's your little girl's face. She had stepped into the doorway and closed her umbrella. Patrice held out his hand and smiled in his turn. Till next time, Image. She hugged him quickly, kissed him on both cheeks and ran upstairs. Mersault, standing in the rain, still felt Martha's cold nose and warm lips on his cheeks. And that sudden, disinterested kiss had all the purity of the one given him by the freckled little whore in Vienna. Then he went to find Lucienne, slept at her apartment, and asked her to walk with him on the boulevards. It was almost noon when they came downstairs. Orange boats were drying in the sun like fruit cut in quarters. The double flock of pigeons and their shadows swooped down to the docks and up again in a long, slow curve. The sun was brilliant and the air grew stifling. Mersault watched the red and black steamer slowly gain the channel, put on speed, and gradually veer toward the streak of light glistening where the sky met. Mersault watched the red and black steamer slowly gain the channel, put on speed, and gradually veer toward the streak of light glistening where the sky met the sea. For the onlookers, there is a bitter sweetness in every departure. They're lucky, Lucienne said. Yes. He was thinking no, or at least that he didn't envy them their luck. For him too, starting over, departures, a new life had a certain luster. But he knew that only the impotent and the lazy attach happiness to such things. Happiness implied a choice, and within that choice a concerted will, a lucid desire. He could hear Zagreus, not the will to renounce, but the will to happiness. He had his arm around Lucienne, and her warm breast rested in his hand. That same evening as he drove back to the Chenois, Mersault felt an enormous silence in himself as he faced the swelling waves and the steep hillsides. By making the gesture of a fresh start, by becoming aware of his past, he had defined what he wanted and what he did not want to be. Those wasted days he had been ashamed of seemed dangerous but necessary now. He might have foundered then and missed his one chance, his one justification. But after all, he had to adapt himself to everything. Rounding one curve after the next, Mersault steeped himself in this humiliating yet priceless truth. The conditions of the singular happiness he sought were getting up early every morning, taking a regular swim, a conscious hygiene. He drove very fast, resolved to take advantage of his discovery in order to establish himself in a routine which would henceforth require no further effort, to harmonize his own breathing with the deepest rhythm of time, of life itself. The next morning he got up early and walked down to the sea. The sky was already brilliant, and the morning full of rustling wings and crying birds. But the sun was only touching the horizon's curve, and when Mersault stepped into the still lusterless water, he seemed to be swimming in an indeterminate darkness until, as the sun climbed higher, he thrust his arms into streaks of icy red and gold. Then he swam back to land and walked up to his house. His body felt alert and ready for whatever the day might bring. Every morning now he came downstairs just before sunrise, and this first action controlled the rest of his day. Moreover, these swims exhausted him, but at the same time, because of the fatigue and the energy they afforded, they gave his entire day a flavor of abandonment and joyful lassitude. Yet the hours still seemed long to him. He had not yet detached time from a carcass of habits which still littered the past. He had nothing to do, and his time stretched out, measureless, before him. Each minute recovered its miraculous value, but he did not yet recognize it for what it was. Just as the days of a journey seem interminable, whereas in an office the trajectory from Monday occurs in a flash, so Mersault, stripped of all his props, still tried to locate them in a life which had nothing but itself to consider. Sometimes he picked up his watch and stared as the minute hand shifted from one number to the next, marveling that 5 minutes should seem so interminable. Doubtless that watch opened the way, a painful and tormenting way, which leads to the supreme art of doing nothing. He learned to walk. Sometimes in the afternoon he would walk along the beach as far as the ruins of Tipasa. Then he would lie down among the wormwood bushes, and with his hands on the warm stone would open his eyes and his heart to the intolerable grandeur of that seething sky. He matched the pounding of his blood with the violent pulsation of the sun at 2 o'clock, and deep in the fierce fragrance, deafened by the invisible insects, he watched the sky turn from white to deep blue, then pale to green, pouring down its sweetness upon the still warm ruins. He would walk home early then, and go to bed. In this passage from sun to sun, his days were organized according to a rhythm whose deliberation and strangeness became as necessary to him as had been his office, his restaurant, and his sleep in his mother's room. In both cases, he was virtually unconscious of it. But now, in his hours of lucidity, he felt that time was his own, that in the brief interval which finds the sea red and leaves it green, something eternal was represented for him in each second. Beyond the curve of the days, he glimpsed neither superhuman happiness nor eternity. Happiness was human, eternity ordinary. What mattered was to humble himself, to organize his heart to match the rhythm of the days instead of submitting their rhythm to the curve of human hopes. Just as there is a moment when the artist must stop, when the sculpture must be left as it is, the painting untouched, just as a determination not to know serves the maker more than all the resources of clairvoyance. So there must be a minimum of ignorance in order to perfect a life in happiness. Those who lack such a thing must set about acquiring it. Unintelligence must be earned. On Sundays, Mersault played pool with Perez. The old fisherman, one arm a stump cut off above the elbow, played pool in a peculiar fashion, puffing out his chest and leaning his stump on the cue. When they went out fishing in the morning, Perez rowed with the same skill, and Mersault admired the way he would stand in the boat pushing one oar with his chest, the other with his good hand. The two men got along well. After the morning's fishing, Perez cooked cuttlefish in a hot sauce, stewing them in their own ink, and soaking up the black juice left in the pan with pieces of bread. As they sat in the fisherman's kitchen over the sooty stove, Perez never spoke, and Mersault was grateful to him for this gift of silence. Sometimes after his morning swim, he would see the old man putting his boat in the sea, and he would join him. "Shall I come with you, Perez?" "Get in." They put the oars in the locks and rowed together, Mersault being careful not to catch his feet in the trawling hooks. Then they would fish, and Mersault would watch the lines gleaming to the water's surface, black and wavering underneath. The sun broke into 1,000 fragments on the sea, and Mersault breathed the heavy, stifling smell that rose from it like fumes. Sometimes Perez pulled in a little fish he would throw back, saying, "Go home to your mother." At 11 they rowed home, and Mersault, his hands glistening with scales and his face swollen with sun, waited in his cool, dark house, while Perez prepared a pan of fish they would eat together in the evening. Day after day, Mersault let himself sink into his life as if he were sliding into water. And just as the swimmer advances by the complicity of his arms and the water which bears him up helps him on, it was enough to make a few essential gestures, to rest one hand on a tree trunk, to take a run on the beach in order to keep himself intact and conscious. Thus he became one with a life in its pure state. He rediscovered a paradise given only to the most private or the most intelligent animals. At the point where the mind denies the mind, he touched his truth and with it his extreme glory, his extreme love. Thanks to Bernard, he also mingled with the life of the village. He had been obliged to send for Bernard to treat some minor indisposition, and since then they had seen each other repeatedly, with pleasure. Bernard was a silent man, but he had a kind of bitter wit that cast a gleam in his horn-rimmed glasses. He had practiced medicine a long time in Indochina, and at 40 had retired to his corner of Algeria, where for several years he had led a tranquil life with his wife, an almost mute Indo-Chinese who wore Western clothes and arranged her hair in a bun. Bernard's capacity for indulgence enabled him to adapt himself to any milieu. He liked the whole village and was liked in return. He took Mersault on his rounds. Mersault already knew the owner of the café, a former tenor who would sing behind his bar and between two beats of Tosca threaten his wife with a beating. Patrice was asked to serve with Bernard on the holiday committee, and on July 14th they walked through the streets in tricolor armbands, or argued with the other committee members sitting around a zinc table sticky with aperitifs, as to whether the bandstand should be decorated with ferns or palms. There was even an attempt to lure him into an electoral contest, but Mersault had had time to know the mayor, who had presided over the destiny of his commune, as he said, for the last decade, and this semi-permanent position inclined him to regard himself as Napoleon Bonaparte. A wealthy grape grower, he had had a Greek-style house built for himself, and proudly showed it to Mersault. It consisted of a ground floor and a second floor around a courtyard, but the mayor had spared no expense and installed an elevator, which he insisted that Mersault and Bernard ride in. And Bernard commented placidly, "Very smooth." The visit had inspired Mersault with a profound admiration for the mayor, and he and Bernard wielded all their influence to keep him in the office he deserved on so many counts. In springtime, the little village with its close-set red roofs between the mountain and the sea overflowed with flowers, roses, hyacinths, bougainvillea, and hummed with insects. Afternoons, Mersault would walk out onto his terrace and watch the village dozing under the torrent of light. Local history consisted of a rivalry between Morales and Bings, two rich Spanish landowners, whom a series of speculations had transformed into millionaires, in the grip of a terrible rivalry. When one bought a car, he chose the most expensive make, but the other, who would buy the same make, would add silver door handles. Morales was a genius at such tactics. He was known in the village as the King of Spain, for on each occasion he triumphed over Bingis, who lacked imagination. During the war, when Bingis pledged several 100,000 francs for a national bond drive, Morales had declared, "I'll do better than that. I'll give my son." And he had made his son, who was too young to be mobilized, volunteer. In 1925, Bingis had driven out from Algiers in a magnificent racing Bugatti. 2 weeks later, Morales had built himself a hangar and bought a plane. The plane was still sleeping in its hangar and was shown to visitors on Sundays. Bingis called Morales that barefoot beggar, and Morales referred to Bingis as that lime kiln. Bernard took Mersault to visit Morales, who welcomed them warmly to his huge farm, humming with wasps and fragrant with grapes. Wearing espadrilles and shirt sleeves because he could not endure a jacket and shoes, Morales showed them the airplane, the sun's medal framed in the living room, and explained the necessity of keeping foreigners out of Algeria. He was naturalized, but that Bings, for instance, then led them to inspect his latest acquisition. They walked through an enormous vineyard in the middle of which was a cleared space where a kind of Louis XVI salon had been set up, each piece made of the most precious woods and fabrics. Thus Morales could receive visitors on his grounds. When Mersault courteously asked what happened when it rained, Morales shifted his cigar, and without even blinking answered, "I replace it." On his way home, Mersault spent the time arguing with Bernard over the difference between the nouveau riche and the poet. Morales, according to Bernard, was a poet. Mersault declared he would have made a splendid Roman emperor during the decline. Sometime later, Lucien came to the Chenois for a few days, then left. One Sunday morning, Clara, Rose, and Catherine paid Mersault a visit, as they had promised. But Patrice was already very far from the state of mind that had driven him to Algiers during the first days of his retreat. He was glad to see them again, nevertheless, and brought Bernard to meet them at the stop where the big yellow bus let them off. It was a magnificent day, the village full of the fine red carts of itinerant butchers, flowers everywhere, and the villagers dressed in bright colors. At Catherine's request, they took a table at the café, and the girls marveled at all this brilliant life, divining the sea's presence behind the wall they leaned against. As they were leaving, an astonishing burst of music exploded in a nearby street, the Toreador song from Carmen, but performed with an exuberance that prevented the instruments from keeping in tune or time. "The Gymnastic Society," Bernard explained. Then some 20 strange musicians appeared, each puffing on a different kind of wind instrument. They marched toward the café, and behind them, his hat worn over a handkerchief on the back of his head, fanning himself with a cheap fan, appeared Morales. He had hired these musicians in the city because, as he explained, with this depression, life around here is too sad. He sat down at a table and grouped the musicians around him, where they finished their rendition. The café was crowded. Then Morales stood up and announced with tremendous dignity, making a sweeping movement toward the audience, "At my request, the orchestra will play Toreador again." As they left, the girls were choking with laughter, but once they reached Mersault's house and the cool shade of the rooms, which emphasized the dazzling whiteness of the sun-drenched garden walls, they discovered a silent harmony that Catherine expressed by the desire to take a sunbath on the terrace. Mersault walked Bernard home. This was the second time the doctor had glimpsed something of Mersault's life. They had never confided in each other. Mersault conscious that Bernard was not a happy man, and Bernard rather baffled by Mersault's way of life. They parted without a word. Mersault and the girls decided to make an excursion the following day, starting very early. The chenua was high and difficult to climb. Ahead of them lay a splendid day of sunlight and fatigue. At dawn they climbed the first steep slopes. Rose and Claire walked ahead, Patrice and Catherine following. No one spoke. Gradually they rose above the sea, still pale in the morning mist. Patrice felt he belonged to the mountain with its pelt of saffron blossoms, his eager but weakening body a part of the icy springs, the shadows, and the sunlight. They entered into the concentrated effort of climbing, the morning air sharp in their lungs, determined to conquer the slope. Rose and Claire, exhausted, began to slow down. Catherine and Patrice walked on and soon lost sight of the other two. Rose and Claire arrived. They shouldered their knapsacks. The path still followed the mountainside, keeping them in a zone of dense vegetation, prickly pears, olive trees, and jujubes. They passed Arabs on donkeys. Then they climbed again. The sun pounded now on each stone in the path. At noon, crushed by the heat, drunk on fragrance and fatigue, they flung down their knapsacks and gave up reaching the top. The slopes were sheer and full of sharp flints. A wizened oak sheltered them in its circle of shade. They took provisions out of the knapsack and ate. The whole mountain quivered under the light. The cicadas were deafening as the heat assailed them under their oak. Patrice threw himself on the ground and pressed his chest against the stones, inhaling the scorched aroma. Under his belly he could feel the faint throbs of the mountain that seemed to be in labor. This regular pulse and the unremitting song of the insects between the hot stones finally put him to sleep. When he awakened, he was covered with sweat, and every muscle ached. It must have been 3 in the afternoon. The girls had vanished, but soon he heard their laughter and shouts. It was cooler now, time to go back down. At this moment, as they were about to start, Mersault fainted for the first time. When he came to, he saw the cobalt sea between 3 anxious faces. They walked on more slowly. On the last slopes, Mersault asked for a rest. The sea was turning green along with the sky, and the horizon began to blur. On the foothills that stretched from the chenua around the little bay, the cypresses blackened slowly. No one spoke until Claire said, "You look tired." "I'm not surprised, are you?" "It's none of my business, but I don't think this place is good for you. It's too near the sea, too damp. Why don't you go live in France, in the mountains?" "This place isn't good for me, Claire, but I'm happy here. I feel in harmony with it." "Well, then you could be in harmony longer." "No one is happy relatively for a longer or shorter time. You're happy or you're not, that's all. And death has nothing to do with it. Death is an accident of happiness in that case." No one spoke. After a long pause, Rose said, "I'm not convinced." They returned slowly as night was falling. Catherine decided to send for Bernard. Mersault was in his room. Beyond the shifting shadow of the window panes he could see the white patch of the parapet, the sea like a strip of dark linen undulating in the transparent air, and beyond it the night sky, paler but starless. He felt weak, and his weakness made him mysteriously lighter, gayer, and his mind grew more lucid. When Bernard knocked, Mersault sensed he would tell him everything. Not that his secret was a burden. It was not that kind of secret. If he had kept it till now, it was because in certain circles a man keeps his thoughts to himself, knowing they will offend the prejudices and stupidity of others. But today, after his exhaustion, there was a sudden longing in his body to confide. It was the way an artist, after carefully molding and caressing his work, at least feels the need to show it, to communicate with men. Mersault had the feeling he was going to speak now, and without being certain he would do so, he waited patiently for Bernard. From downstairs 2 bursts of laughter made him smile, and at that moment Bernard came into the room. "Well?" Well, here I am, Mersault said. Bernard listened to his chest, but he could tell nothing. He wanted to have an X-ray taken if Mersault could manage to get to Algiers. Later, Mersault replied. Bernard said nothing and sat down on the windowsill. I don't like being sick myself, he said. I know what it is. Nothing is uglier or more degrading than sickness. Mersault was unconcerned. He got up from his chair, offered Bernard a cigarette, lit his own, and said with a laugh, Can I ask you a question, Bernard? Of course. You never swim, you're never on the beach. Why did you pick this place to live in? Oh, I don't know exactly. It was a long time ago. After a pause, he added, Besides, I've always acted out of rancor. It's better now. Before, I wanted to be happy, to do what had to be done, to settle down somewhere I really wanted to be, for instance. But sentimental anticipation is always wrong. We have to live the way it's easiest for us to live, not forcing ourselves. I suppose it sounds a little cynical, but it's also the point of view you have to take to survive. In Indochina, I ran all over the place. Here I just ruminate. That's all. Yes, Mersault said, still smoking, deep in his armchair and staring at the ceiling. But I'm not sure that all sentimental anticipation, as you call it, is wrong. Only unreasonable sometimes. In any case, the only experiences that interest me are precisely the ones where everything turns out to be the way you hoped it would. Bernard smiled. Yes, a ready-made destiny. A man's destiny, Mersault said without moving, is always passionately interesting if he achieves it passionately. And for some men, a passionate destiny is always a ready-made destiny. Yes, Bernard said, and he stood up deliberately and stared out at the night for a moment, his back to Mersault. He went on without looking at him. You're the only man besides myself around here who lives alone. I don't mean your wife and your friends downstairs. I know those are episodes. Still, even so, you seem to love life more than I do. He turned around. Because for me, loving life is not going for a swim. It's living in intoxication, intensity. Women, adventures, other countries. It's action, making something happen. A burning, marvelous life. What I mean is, I want you to understand me. He seemed ashamed of his excitement. I love life too much to be satisfied with nature. Bernard put away his stethoscope and closed his bag. Mersault said, Actually, you're an idealist. And he had the sense that everything was enclosed in that moment, which shifts from birth to death, that everything was judged and consecrated then. That's because, you see, Bernard said with a kind of sadness, the opposite of an idealist is too often a man without love. Don't believe it, Mersault said, holding out his hand. Bernard held his hand a long time. To think the way you do, he said, smiling, you have to be a man who lives either on a tremendous despair or on a tremendous hope. Or both, perhaps. Oh, I wasn't asking. I know, Mersault said seriously. But when Bernard was at the door, Mersault, impelled by a sudden need, called him back. Yes, the doctor said, turning around. Are you capable of feeling contempt for a man? I think so. On what conditions? The doctor reflected. It's quite simple, I think. In cases when he was motivated by expediency or a desire for money. That is simple, Mersault said. Good night, Bernard. Good night. Alone, Mersault reflected. At the point he had now reached, another man's contempt left him indifferent. But he recognized in Bernard profound resonances that brought the two of them together. It seemed intolerable that a part of himself should condemn the rest. Had he acted out of expediency? He had become aware of the essential and immoral truth that money is one of the surest and swiftest means of acquiring one's dignity. He had managed to dispel the bitterness which besets any decent soul aware of the vile iniquities of the birth and growth of a splendid fate. This sordid and revolting curse, whereby the poor end in poverty the life they have begun in poverty, he had rejected by using money as a weapon, opposing hatred with hatred. And out of this beast-to-beast combat, the angel sometimes emerged, intact, wings and halo and all, in the warm breath of the sea. It would be as it had been. He had said nothing to Bernard, and his creation would henceforth remain secret. The girls left around 5 o'clock in the afternoon of the next day. As they got into the bus, Catherine turned back. "Goodbye, sea," she said. A moment later, 3 laughing faces were staring at Mersault out of the rear window, and the yellow bus vanished like a huge golden insect into the sun. Though clear, the sky was a little heavy. Mersault, standing alone in the road, felt a deep sense of deliverance tinged with melancholy. Only today did his solitude become real. For only today did he feel bound to it, and to have accepted that solitude, to know that henceforth he was the master of all his days to come, filled him with the melancholy that is attached to all greatness. In January the almond trees bloomed. In March the pear, peach, and apple trees were covered with blossoms. The next month the streams gradually swelled, then returned to a normal flow. Early in May the hay was cut, and the oats and barley at the month's end. Already the apricots were ripening. In June the early pears appeared with the major crops. The streams began to dry up, and the heat grew more intense. But the earth's blood, shrinking here on the coast, made the cotton bloom farther inland and sweetened the first grapes. A great hot wind arose, parching the land and spreading brush fires everywhere. And then, suddenly, the year changed direction. Hurriedly, the grape harvests were brought to an end. The downpours of September and October drenched the land. No sooner was the summer's work done than the first sowing began, while the streams in spring suddenly swelled to torrents with the rain. At the year's end, the wheat was already sprouting in some fields. On others, plowing had only just been finished. A little later, the almond trees were once again white against the ice-blue sky. The new year had begun in the earth, in the sky. Tobacco was planted, vines cultivated and fertilized, trees grafted. In the same month, the medlars ripened. Again the haymaking, the harvesting, the summer plowing. Halfway through the year, the ripe fruits, juicy and sticky, were served on every table. Between one threshing and the next, the men ate the figs, peaches, and pears greedily. During the next grape harvest, the sky grew overcast. Out of the north, silent flocks of black starlings and thrushes passed over. For them, the olives were already ripe. Soon after they had flown away, the olives were gathered. The wheat sprouted a second time from the viscous soil. Huge clouds also from the north passed over the sea, then the land, brushing the water with foam and leaving it smooth and icy under a crystal sky. For several days there were distant silent flashes in the sky. The first cold spells set in. In January the almond trees bloomed. In March the pear, peach, and apple trees were covered with blossoms. The next month the streams gradually swelled, then returned to a normal flow. Early in May the hay was cut, and the oats and barley at the month's end. Already the apricots were ripening. In June the early pears appeared with the major crops. The streams began to dry up, and the heat grew more intense. But the earth's blood, shrinking here on the coast, made the cotton bloom farther inland and sweetened the first grapes. A great hot wind arose, parching the land and spreading brush fires everywhere. And then, suddenly, the year changed direction. Hurriedly, the grape harvests were brought to an end. The downpours of September and October drenched the land. No sooner was the summer's work done than the first sowing began, while the streams in spring suddenly swelled to torrents with the rain. At the year's end, the wheat was already sprouting in some fields. On others, plowing had only just been finished. A little later, the almond trees were once again white against the ice-blue sky. The new year had begun in the earth, in the sky. Tobacco was planted, vines cultivated and fertilized, trees grafted. In the same month, the medlars ripened. Again the haymaking, the harvesting, the summer plowing. Halfway through the year, the ripe fruits, juicy and sticky, were served on every table. Between one threshing and the next, the men ate the figs, peaches, and pears greedily. During the next grape harvest, the sky grew overcast. Out of the north, silent flocks of black starlings and thrushes passed over. For them, the olives were already ripe. Soon after they had flown away, the olives were gathered. The wheat sprouted a second time from the viscous soil. Huge clouds also from the north passed over the sea, then the land, brushing the water with foam and leaving it smooth and icy under a crystal sky. For several days there were distant silent flashes in the sky. The first cold spells set in. During this period, Mersault took to his bed for the first time. Bouts of pleurisy confined him to his room for a month. When he got up, the foothills of the Chenua were covered with flowering trees, all the way to the sea's edge. Never had spring touched him so deeply. The first night of his convalescence, he walked across the fields for a long time, as far as the hill where the ruins of Tipasa slept. In a silence violated only by the silky sounds of the sky, the night lay like milk upon the world. Mersault walked along the cliff, sharing the night's deep concentration. Below him the sea whispered gently. It was covered with velvety moonlight, smooth and undulating, like the pelt of some animal. At this hour of night his life seemed so remote to him. He was so solitary and indifferent to everything and to himself as well, that Mersault felt he had at last attained what he was seeking, that the peace which filled him now was born of that patient self-abandonment he had pursued and achieved with the help of this warm world, so willing to deny him without anger. He walked lightly, and the sound of his own footsteps seemed alien to him. Familiar too, no doubt, but familiar the way the rustling of animals in the mastic bushes was familiar, or the breaking waves or the rhythm of the night itself in the sky overhead. And he could feel his own body too, but with the same external consciousness as the warm breath of this spring night, and the smell of salt and decay that rose from the beach. His actions in the world, his thirst for happiness, Zagreus's terrible wound bearing brain and bone, the sweet uncommitted hours in the house above the world, his wife, his hopes and his gods, all this lay before him, but no more than one story chosen among so many others without any valid reason, at once alien and secretly familiar, a favorite book which flatters and justifies the heart at its core, but a book someone else has written. For the first time, Mersault was aware of no other reality in himself than that of a passion for adventure, a desire for power, a warm and an intelligent instinct for a relationship with the world without anger, without hatred, without regret. Sitting on a rock, he let his fingers explore its crannies as he watched the sea swell in silence under the moon. He thought of Lucien's face he had caressed, and the warmth of her lips. The moon poured its long, straying smiles like oil on the water's smooth surface. The sea would be warm as a mouth, and as soft, ready to yield beneath a man's weight. Motionless now, Mersault felt how close happiness is to tears, caught up in that silent exultation which weaves together the hopes and despairs of human life. Conscious yet alienated, devoured by passion yet disinterested, Mersault realized that his life and his fate were completed here, and that henceforth all his efforts would be to submit to this happiness and to confront its terrible truth. Now he must sink into the warm sea, lose himself in order to find himself again, swim in that warm moonlight in order to silence what remained of the past, to bring to birth the deep song of his happiness. He undressed, clambered down a few rocks, and entered the sea. It was as warm as a body, another body that ran down his arms and clung to his legs with an ineffable yet omnipresent embrace. Mersault swam steadily now, feeling the muscles of his back shift with each stroke. Whenever he raised an arm, he cast sheaves of silver drops upon the sea, sowing under this mute and vivid sky the splendid harvest of happiness. Then his arm thrust back into the water, and like a vigorous plowshare tilled the waves, dividing them in order to gain a new support, a firmer hope. Behind him, his feet churned the water into seething foam, producing a strangely distinct hissing noise in the night silence and solitude. Conscious of this cadence, this vigor, an exultation seized Mersault. He swam faster and soon realized he was far from land, alone in the heart of the night, of the world. Suddenly he thought of the depths which lay beneath him and stopped moving. Everything that was below attracted him like an unknown world. The extension of this darkness which restored him to himself, the salty center of a life still unexplored. A temptation flashed through his mind, but he immediately rejected it in the great joy of his body. He swam harder, farther. Gloriously tired, he turned back toward the shore. At that moment he suddenly entered an icy current and was forced to stop swimming. His teeth shattered. His movements lost their harmony. This surprise of the sea left him bewildered. The chill penetrated his limbs and seared him like the love of some god of clear and impassioned exultation, whose embrace left him powerless. Laboriously he returned to the beach, where he dressed facing the sky and the sea, shivering and laughing with happiness. On his way home, he began to feel faint. From the path sloping up toward his house, he could make out the rocky promontory across the bay, the smooth shafts of the columns among the ruins. Then suddenly the landscape tilted and he found himself leaning against a rock, half supported by a mastic bush, the fragrance of its crushed leaves strong in his nostrils. He dragged himself back to the house. His body, which had just now carried him to the limits of joy, plunged him into a suffering that gripped his bowels, making him close his eyes. He decided tea would help, but he used a dirty pan to boil the water in, and the tea was so greasy it made him retch. He drank it, though, before he went to bed. As he was pulling off his shoes, he noticed how pink his nails were, long and curving over the fingertips of his bloodless hands. His nails had never been like that, and they gave his hands a twisted, unhealthy look. His chest felt as though it were caught in a vice. He coughed and spat several times, only phlegm, though the taste of blood lingered on his tongue. In bed, his body was seized by long spasms of shivering. He could feel the chill rising from every extremity of his body, meeting in his shoulders like a confluence of icy streams, while his teeth chattered and the sheets felt as if they had been soaked. The house seemed enormous. The usual noises swelled to infinity, as if they encountered no wall to put an end to their echoes. He heard the sea, the pebbles rolling under the receding wave, the night throbbing behind his windows, the dogs howling on distant farms. He was hot now, threw back the blankets, then cold again, and drew them up. As he wavered between one suffering and another, between somnolence and anxiety, he suddenly realized he was sick, and anguish overwhelmed him at the thought that he might die in this unconsciousness, without being able to see clearly. The village steeple chimed, but he could not keep count of the strokes. He did not want to die like a sick man. He did not want his sickness to be what it is so often, an attenuation, a transition to death. What he really wanted was the encounter between his life, a life filled with blood and health, and death. He stood, dragged a chair over to the window and sat down in it, huddling in his blankets. Through the thin curtains, in the places where the material did not fall in folds, he saw the stars. He breathed heavily for a long time, and gripped the arms of his chair to control his trembling hands. He would reconquer his lucidity if he could. It could be done, he was thinking. And he was thinking, too, that the gas was still on in the kitchen. It could be done, he thought again. Lucidity, too, was a long patience. Everything could be won, earned, acquired. He struck his fist on the arm of the chair. A man is not born strong, weak, or decisive. He becomes strong, he becomes lucid. Fate is not in man, but around him. Then he realized he was crying. A strange weakness, a kind of cowardice born of his sickness, gave way to tears, to childishness. His hands were cold, his heart filled with an immense disgust. He thought of his nails, and under his collarbone he pressed tumors that seemed enormous. Outside, all that beauty was spread upon the face of the world. He did not want to abandon his thirst for life, his jealousy of life. He thought of those evenings above Algiers, when the sound of sirens rises in the green sky, and men leave their factories. The fragrance of wormwood, the wildflowers among the ruins, and the solitude of the cypresses in the Sahel generated an image of life where beauty and happiness took on an aspect without the need of hope, a countenance in which Patrice found a kind of fugitive eternity. That was what he did not want to leave. He did not want that image to persist without him. Filled with rebellion and pity, he saw Zagreus's face turn toward the window. Then he coughed for a long time. It was hard to breathe. He was smothering under his blankets. He was cold. He was hot. He was burning with a great confusing rage, his fists clenched, his blood throbbing heavily under his skull. Eyes blank, he waited for the new spasm that would plunge him back into the blind fever. The chill came, restoring him to a moist, sealed world, in which he silenced the animal rebellion, eyes closed, jealous of his thirst and his hunger. But before losing consciousness, he had time to see the night turn pale behind the curtains and to hear, with the dawn and the world's awakening, a kind of tremendous chord of tenderness and hope, which without doubt dissolved his fear of death. though at the same time it assured him he would find a reason for dying in what had been his whole reason for living. When he awakened, the morning had already begun, and all the birds and insects were singing in the warmth of the sun. He remembered Lucien was coming today. Exhausted, he crawled back to his bed. His mouth tasted of fever, and he could feel the onset of that fragility which makes every effort arduous and other people so irritating in the eyes of the sick. He sent for Bernard, who came at once, quiet and businesslike as always. He listened to Mersault's chest, then took off his glasses and wiped the lenses. "Bad," was all he would say. He gave Mersault 2 injections. During the second, Mersault fainted, though ordinarily he was not squeamish. When he came to, Bernard was holding his wrist in one hand and his watch in the other, watching the jerky advance of the second hand. "That lasted 15 minutes, Bernard said. "Your heart's failing. The next time you might not come out of it." Mersault closed his eyes. He was exhausted, his lips white and dry, his breathing a hoarse whistle. "Bernard," he said. "Yes." "I don't want to die in a coma. I want to see what's happening. Do you understand me?" "Yes," Bernard said, and gave him several ampules. "If you feel weak, break this open and swallow it. It's adrenaline." As he was leaving, Bernard met Lucienne on her way in, as charming as ever. "Is Patrice sick?" "Yes." "Is he serious?" "No, he's all right," Bernard said, and just before he was out the door. "One piece of advice, though, try to leave him alone as much as you can." "Oh," Lucienne said, "then it can't be anything." All day long Mersault coughed and choked. Twice he felt the cold, stubborn chill which would draw him into another coma, and twice the adrenaline rescued him from that dark immersion. And all day long his dim eyes stared at the magnificent landscape. Around 4, a large red rowboat appeared on the sea, gradually growing larger, glistening with sunlight, brine, and fish scales. Perez, standing, rowed on steadily. Mersault closed his eyes and smiled for the first time since the day before, though he did not unclench his teeth. Lucienne, who had been fussing around the room, vaguely uneasy, threw herself on the bed and kissed him. "Sit down," Mersault said. "You can stay. Don't talk, you'll tire yourself out." Bernard came, gave injections, left. Huge red clouds moved slowly across the sky. "When I was a child," Mersault said laboriously, leaning back on the pillow, his eyes fixed on the sky, "my mother told me that was the souls of the dead going to paradise. I was amazed they had red souls. Now I know it means a storm is coming, but it's still amazing." Night was beginning to fall. Images came. Enormous, fantastic animals which nodded over desert landscapes. Mersault gently swept them away, despite his fever. He let only Zagreus's face appear, a sign of blood brotherhood. He who had inflicted death was going to die. And then, as for Zagreus, the lucid gaze he cast upon his life was a man's gaze. Until now he had lived. Now he could talk of his life, of that great ravaging energy which had borne him on, of that fugitive and generating poetry of life. Nothing was left now but the transparent truth, which is the opposite of poetry. Of all the men he had carried inside himself, as every man does at the beginning of this life, of all those various rootless mingling beings, he had created his life with consciousness, with courage. That was his whole happiness in living and dying. He realized now that to be afraid of this death he was staring at with animal terror meant to be afraid of life. Fear of dying justified a limitless attachment to what is alive in man, and all those who had not made the gestures necessary to live their lives, all those who feared and exalted impotence, they were afraid of death because of the sanction it gave to a life in which they had not been involved. They had not lived enough, never having lived at all. And death was a kind of gesture, forever withholding water from the traveler vainly seeking to slake his thirst. But for the others, it was the fatal and tender gesture that erases and denies, smiling at gratitude as at rebellion. He spent a day and a night sitting on his bed, his arms on the night table, and his head on his arms. He could not breathe lying down. Lucienne sat beside him and watched him without speaking a word. Sometimes Mersault looked at her. He realized that after he was gone, the first man who put his arms around her would make her soften, submit. She would be offered, her body, her breasts, as she had been offered to him, and the world would continue in the warmth of her parted lips. Sometimes he raised his head and stared out the window. He had not shaved. His red-rimmed, hollow eyes had lost their dark luster, and his pale, sunken cheeks under the bluish stubble transformed him completely. His gaze came to rest on the panes. He sighed and turned toward Lucienne. Then he smiled. And in his face that was collapsing, even vanishing. The hard, lucid smile wakened a new strength, a cheerful gravity. "Better?" Lucienne asked in a whisper. "Yes." Then he returned to darkness between his arms. At the limit of his strength and his resistance, he joined Roland Zagros for the first time, whose smile had so exasperated him in the beginning. His short, gasping breath left a moist cloud on the marble of the night table. And in that sickly warmth rising toward him from the stone, he felt even more distinctly the icy tips of his fingers and toes. Even that revealed life, though, and in this journey from cold to warm, he discovered the exaltation which had seized Zagros, thanking life for allowing him to go on burning. He was overcome by a violent and fraternal love for this man, from whom he had felt so distant, and he realized that by killing him, he had consummated a union which bound them together forever. That heavy approach of tears, a mingled taste of life and death, was shared by them both, he realized now. And in Zagros's very immobility confronting death, he encountered the secret image of his own life. Fever helped him here, and with it, an exultant certainty of sustaining consciousness to the end, of dying with his eyes open. Zagros, too, had had his eyes open that day, and tears had fallen from them. But that was the last weakness of a man who had not had his share of life. Patrice was not afraid of such weakness. In the pounding of his feverish blood, though it failed to reach the limits of his body, he understood that such weakness would not be his. For he had played his part, fashioned his role, perfected man's one duty, which is only to be happy. Not for long, no doubt. He had destroyed the obstacle, and this inner brother he had engendered in himself. What did it matter if he existed for 2 or for 20 years? Happiness was the fact that he had existed. The blanket slipped from Mersault's shoulders, and when Lucienne stood up to cover him, he shuddered at her touch. Since the day he had sneezed in the little square near Zagros' villa to this moment, his body had served him faithfully, had opened him to the world, but at the same time, it lived a life of its own, detached from the man it represented. For these few years it had passed through a slow decomposition. Now it had completed its trajectory and was ready to leave Mersault, to restore him to the world. In that sudden shudder of which Mersault was conscious, his body indicated once more a complicity which had already won so many joys for them both. Solely for this reason, Mersault took pleasure in that shudder. Conscious, he must be conscious. He must be conscious, without deception, without cowardice, alone, face to face, at grips with his body, eyes open upon death. It was a man's business, not love, not a landscape, nothing but an infinite waste of solitude and happiness in which Mersault was playing his last cards. He felt his breathing weaken. He gasped for air, and in that movement his ruined lungs wheezed. His wrists were cold now, and there was no feeling in his hands at all. Day was breaking. The new day was cool, filled with the sound of birds. The sun rose quickly, and in a single leap was above the horizon. The earth was covered with gold, with warmth. In the morning, sky and sea were spattered with dancing patches of blue and yellow light. A light breeze had risen, and through the window a breath of salt air cooled Mersault's hands.